Thank you all for coming this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about myself so that you'll know where this research is coming from. My area of specialty is African American literature of the early 20th century, which includes the study of the Harlem Renaissance, which is a part of the Jazz Age. My secondary area of emphasis is digital humanities, or digital Africana studies. Now what that means is that we as faculty members use a variety of technologies as a part of our teaching, and we encourage our students to use a variety of technologies to express their understanding of whatever it is that is a part of our course content. As a result of that, I created the Virtual Harlem Project during my graduate studies at the University of Missouri, Columbia. The Virtual Harlem Project was meant to be a representation of a portion of Harlem, New York as it existed during the 1920s Jazz Age. I wanted my students to be able to experience that which we were reading during our class, because I saw that there was a bit of a disconnect between what we were doing in class and the students being able to connect with that literature in various ways. Now, the Virtual Harlem Project has existed in a variety of formats since the late 1990s, and today I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of this particular project. Early on, it existed in cave environments. A cave is a three-walled environment very similar to this, where the walls of that environment are backlit video displays, and you feel like you are fully immersed within that particular setting. Early on, the Virtual Harlem Project existed there because we were creating this on very, very strong supercomputers, and that was the environment in which it was created. The environment also then transformed or evolved into the multi-user environment called Second Life. And Second Life, of course, existed a number of years ago. It still is around. But it was one where we wanted our students to be able to connect with one another in a multi-user environment. It moved through Second Life, and now it exists in an environment called Unity 3D. Unity 3D is a full-fledged gaming environment, and this was part of our overall objective, which basically meant that we were going to recreate a street grid of this particular portion of Harlem, New York. And you can see that we used OpenStreetMaps, and we were able to overlay what we were doing right on top of the Google Street Maps here that represented this section of Harlem, New York during a contemporary period. But the street grid layout really didn't change that much from the 1920s, very early 30s until now. Of course, some changes, but not very many. I show this in order to represent the evolution of Virtual Harlem. This is what it looks like now. And I've been working with a number of very talented students who have been assisting with recreating this in a 3D environment. This is part of the building of Virtual Harlem and how it was reconstructed in this environment through a video and through an environment called Curio, which is a 3D web browser created by an organization in Vancouver, Washington, British Columbia, I'm sorry. And that particular organization created the very early build of Virtual Harlem in this gaming engine called Unity 3D. They were able to not only assist with the recreation of several of the iconic buildings like the Cotton Club and the Apollo Theater and Small's Paradise and many of the other very important locations that I wanted my students to be able to experience as part of the inspiration for the writers and the poets and the artists of that time period. So Unity is the underlying background or the underlying runtime engine that makes the current version of Virtual Harlem really work well. What you're going to see here in just a few moments is the continued evolution of this particular environment. So we've moved from grand supercomputers the size of some of these doorways to desktop computers interacting with one another in environments like Second Life and Open Simulator, which is the open source version of Second Life. Through this environment called Curio, and now existing in the gaming engine called Unity 3D. Why did we do that? Well, we wanted to be able to not only increase the resolution, eventually moving to somewhere near photorealism. We wanted to increase the interaction, so we would be able to incorporate common scripting languages. And most of all, we were very concerned about copyright and ownership. When we were in some of the other platforms, the other platform claimed ownership of much of the information or the content that was created and placed on their platform. When you're using something like Unity, you're using what is referred to as open standards. So you're creating these in 3D modeling programs like Maya or 3D Studio Max or any of the other freely accessible, not freely, but open source or open standards, accessible 3D modeling programs that allow you to create and you maintain ownership of all of your assets and all of the content that is created and placed within this particular environment. So this is just a video output of what you're going to see in real time. Part of what we also wanted to do was make use of some of the more modern display environments. So in addition to being able to access this on your computers and on your desktop, laptops, very strong laptops like the one that I brought here, we're also making use of some of the modern display environments such as the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive. Now these have just come out on the market just this past month, and they're full immersive headsets. What you're seeing now is a very interesting collaboration that I've had with a colleague of mine that is expanding the notion of what virtual Harlem really is all about, and looking at this idea of an overall theme, the Great Negro Migration, as African Americans moved from the South to many places in the North, to include Chicago and Harlem, New York, and many other locations, as well as out west. New cultures developed as a result of that migration. And we wanted our students to be able to experience those cultures in various ways, to be able to relive the stories and experience some of that which inspired, once again, the literature that was written during that period. So as students are entering these spaces, and these are just some of the stills that have been created until I tell you about the next move that we're making. These still models allow students to be able to explore that which is represented in the literature, but also eventually be able to add to this content. And there's where I think these kinds of virtual worlds really become very powerful. So in addition to students just simply being passive explorers in a virtual museum, they actually become active participants and contributors to this space that allows them to incorporate their research and their presentations and their creative output. So their creations and their information can then become a part of a collective that others will be able to then experience in a variety of ways. So this happens to be one of the mini clubs that are in Chicago that my colleague created. He wanted to create the south side of Chicago that was running parallel at the same time that the Harlem Renaissance was also very, very vibrant. You see, one of the misnomers is that when you talk about the Harlem Renaissance, people automatically think that things were just happening related to African American culture in a place like Harlem. Well, in addition to that, things were going on in East St. Louis, Illinois, in Kansas City, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C., as well as in places like Paris and other locations in Europe. So when you think about this idea of the Harlem Renaissance, it was a global phenomenon. And this is just the beginning of what we hope to be able to do. The oral histories, and you're not able to hear this one right now, but the oral histories that we also want to create and collect and place within this space are ones that other students will be able to not only go out and collect from those who happen to still be living, but also ones that they read about and that they can then re-embody through their representation of that particular person through an avatar. So these avatars are the next evolution of the Virtual Harlem project. Thank you. What I'd like to do now is a colleague of mine that I just met, Chris, has so graciously volunteered to come up and be a part of this particular presentation, please. And I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to have him go ahead and pop on the Oculus Rift here. The Oculus Rift is a 3D head-mounted display that allows users to enter a space and they're fully immersed within that space. As Chris looks around, up and down and all around him, he's fully immersed within Virtual Harlem right now. I'm going to steer him into a few locations here that allows us to really get a chance to see some of the things that we were able to actually look at a little bit through the video. So we can actually go inside the Cotton Club. And we can see that, of course, it's relatively empty right now. The next iteration of this particular environment is going to allow us to, excuse me, I'm making you sick, Chris, I don't mean to do that. The next iteration of this environment is going to allow us to actually 3D body scan students and then motion capture them so that we'll be able to then animate their avatars and bring this particular environment to life. I'd like to show you one other location here as Chris deals with my very bad driving within this environment. I do apologize once again. And we're going to go inside one of the speakeasies that we've also modeled the inside of. And so as we enter this particular speakeasy, we'll be able to see yet another environment. And so the notion here being is that full immersion gives one a sense of place. It gives one a sense of location that, once again, we can then begin to interact with in a variety of ways. Of course, I'll have you take that off because I do want to show this one last video. Thank you very, very much. So the Oculus Rift is, as I mentioned before, just coming out, and it's actually just now shipping. The HTC Vive, which is another head-mounted display, allows us to put sensors in the corners of a room, and we'll be able to see virtual objects that are in the room in real life, but yet we can actually see them from within this immersive space. The next iteration of Virtual Harlem that we actually are currently working on this summer took place with a number of my students participating over the spring semester. They volunteered to be 3D body scanned, and we were actually going to then take their 3D scans and place them within this environment. So a number of my students dressed in period clothing, and we're able to 3D body scan them using a very simple scanner that connects to an iPad, and you can see that it captures photogrammetry as well as 3D textures, so that we're able to then, of course, create avatars that look like real people. So instead of them looking as cartoonish as some avatars tend to look nowadays, we're able to bring these to a different level of photorealism because we're actually capturing the images that are created by this particular body scanner, as you can see. The next iteration is to, of course, animate these avatars. And we have a motion capture studio on campus, thank you, that allows us to capture motion using Microsoft Connect. And through this particular low-cost version of motion capture, we're able to recreate period dances, performances, or any other movements that can then be placed within this particular environment. So this is also being done this summer. So this is how Virtual Harlem is being brought to life. It started off at the very relatively low end, but in 1997, this was a relatively high end. It moved through the desktop and through environments like Second Life and OpenSim It's now residing in a full-fledged gaming environment that allows us to do all of these wonderful things in order to really bring it to life and give it a sense of place in ways that we've never been able to do before. We can incorporate scripting and interactivity, and you'll actually be able to then look at how you can interact with not only a virtual character, but also the environment itself. The very last iteration I'd like to tell you about is how we hope to be able to incorporate artificial intelligence. So when you interact with a character, you'll be able to ask it questions and access big data. Find out who owned that particular building or where a performance is taking place, or even incorporate some game-like elements within this particular world. So we have a lot of big plans, and maybe next year when I come back, we'll be able to show you some of those brand new iterations. But I did want to give you an update of where we were with the Virtual Harlem project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.